If you die before you die, you won't die when you die. This is the inscribed epigram above the gateway of an Orthodox Christian monastery on Mount Athos in Greece. This puzzle of a sentence was designed to confound the mind and steer it towards a profound meaning of spiritual truth. If your ego dies prior to the death of your physical body, then your essence, self, will not die when your physical body dies. The root idea of this brain-tingling riddle has a long history within various ranks of mystical and psychological paths. From the mystery cults to ancient Greece, to Sufism, to Jungian psychology, and by way of a wide variety of modern spiritual thinkers, including Alan Watts and Eckhart Tolle, the mystical and initiatory path towards the awaiting and yawning grave is to experience the death of ego first. Ego death, or ego dissolution, is the complete loss of subjective self-identity. The path towards ego death can be activated in a wide variety of ways, including meditation, prayer, psychological models, near-death experiences, altered states of consciousness, and psychedelics. The dissolution of the ego is synonymous to the human experience, regardless of culture, religious, or spiritual backgrounds. Muslim Sufis refer to ego death as fana, annihilation. Medieval Jewish Kabbalists call this process the kiss of death. In Buddhism, it is called ego death. And in Jungian psychology, it is referred to as psychic death. In psychedelic culture, ego loss, a term coined by Harvard LSD researcher Timothy Leary in the 1960s, and used to describe the first phase of an LSD trip in which an individual experiences a complete transcendence of the self, is achieved through the use of psychedelic drugs by way of a total annihilation and an instant, merciless destruction of all previous reference points of the life of the individual. Although this process aids in the facilitation of a death of self, the idea of ego loss or dissolution also signals the concept of reintegrating the self back into a unified, cohesive whole, which is one of the 4 steps of Jungian alchemical transformation towards individuation. The concept of complete annihilation of a sense of self sounds horrifying and daunting, but what arises after this exceptional experience is a rebirth. Beyond the challenges of ego dissolution, a person can experience a boundary-dissolving oneness of interconnectivity to all living things, a deeper connection to love and empathy, healing of past traumas, and an awakening into a more positive mindset. My name is Tree Carr, and I'm going to journey with you through an intuitive inquiry and co-creative exploration into questions about how a psychedelic-assisted ego death can help prepare a person for biological death. As a death doula, I have observed the challenging psychological, emotional, and spiritual terrains of individuals as they have moved towards death. And having experienced my own ego death from the psychedelic brew ayahuasca, I decided to find others and dive into their experiences on how ayahuasca taught them to die before they die. Evidence of the use of the psychoactive brew ayahuasca dates back 1,000 years. Considered as ceremonial spiritual medicine and a plant teacher within the indigenous people of the Amazon, the decoction is made from the Banisteriopsis caapi vine and the Psychotria viridis shrub. The shrub contains N,N-dimethyltryptamine, otherwise known as DMT, and the vine contains several alkaloids that act as monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which are required for DMT to be orally active. The combination of these two plants is boiled down into a thick liquid, and when ingested causes an altered state of consciousness, altered perceptions of reality, hallucinations, and peak mystical experiences. The vine of the dead is also reported to propel a person into higher spiritual dimensions and facilitates communication with entities and spiritual or extra-dimensional beings who act as guides or healers. Following ayahuasca ingestion, vomiting can occur, and this purging is considered to be a necessary part of the experience, representing the release of negative energy and emotions built up over the course of one's life. Studies have revealed that ayahuasca has been found to interact specifically with the visual cortex of the brain, which suggests that ayahuasca activates a complicated network of vision and memory, which heightens the internal reality of the participants. As a result, it is reported that people may experience profound positive life changes as a result of consuming ayahuasca.
There were 2 ceremonies over 2 nights, and the first night had been very powerful in all kinds of ways. And I felt the immensity, the immense force, intelligence, vastness of reality of the world, and where I sat within it, like the true kind of minuscule element that I was within this kind of much bigger landscape. And it was so humbling to the point where I felt completely and utterly crushed, actually. Like it was like a physical force, like the weight of gravity, like just absolutely immense. And what came with it was a lot of shame about the way in which I projected out into the, like, it was like I understood the way the world really was, and I understood how my entire framing of my own experience was completely the wrong way around. Like, I am the center of my universe, right? And I live as if I am the center of the universe, and I push out into the world, constantly looking for affirmation, seeking to kind of demonstrate that I know things, right? Whereas I know a tiny, minuscule amount, again, versus the just like intelligence woven through everything, everywhere. Humbling gets used in this kind of the context of like, I'm so humbled to get nominated for like, it was like not that kind of humbling. It's not like, it was like properly actually really understanding the way of things. But what came with it was kind of smashed in some way. I felt like I had to start again. There was a presence there. I felt like I was feeling life force, actually. It just wasn't my own, but there was life force. So there's something very vital and powerful about that. People in the room turned into spirits. They were both incredibly young and like tens of thousands of years old. They were like, at last, like, they were like, God, you took your time, sort of thing. They were separate, but they were all one as well. So they weren't physically joined, but I was one of them. So it was like we were just light. That's what we were. Like everything that boundaries me in this moment just had gone, and it was exquisitely beautiful. It was more real than any experience I've had in this reality. It felt like I was probably dead, but I didn't know. And there was like such a kind of joyous, liberating feeling of having entered into this domain. And they were like, you've got here. I felt like to die was not a tragedy, it was not, well, it was very beautiful. But I also then sort of thoughts turned to my family. I was like, am I lying here? And I had this thought that I was like lying in a coma. You hear these stories of people lying in a coma and they kind of exit their body and they're above their body. And I was like, is that what's happening to me? Am I just one of these instances where something just went horribly wrong? What would my parents think? Someone's going to have to tell them. And I felt like I had a choice as to whether I wanted to live or die. And I was like, but I couldn't figure out what was more courageous. And in my head, I had these kind of stories of like, well, you know, you hear these stories of people who really fight to live and come back into their bodies. But then there was another part of me that thought, actually, maybe the most courageous thing to do is to fight to stay in this, like I've made it. Like it felt like it was a long, like the way in which they were talking, like finally, it felt like it had taken, like I'd been obscuring this reality for a long, long time. It was actually very frightening to not know whether to live or die. And it took me a long time, I don't know how long, maybe an hour or something, to pluck up the courage to speak to someone, because there were other people still in the room. And I said to a woman in the room, I managed to ask, I said, am I dead or am I alive? And I remember it so vividly. She said to me, she said, you're more alive than you've ever been, which actually is the most confusing answer to give to someone in that state. Because I thought that probably meant was more likely that I'm dead, actually, as an answer. Because that's what it felt like, that I'd liberated myself into something that was like pure life, but it required death. I think it has completely changed my cosmology and way of experiencing the world. I mean, I would say I was a very kind of rational, material person prior to that, and quite dismissive of anything that kind of sat outside of that. I see things completely differently now. My view of death or life after death, I suppose, has in a large part now become framed by a Buddhist cosmology of the world. I've definitely felt held in a very loving way. So it was like, in a way, it was like, I'm showing you something, or I was being guided towards something in a way quite horrifying for my ego anyway, but I still felt held in it with something kind of bigger and more loving. So, and that's been my experience of that medicine. She does have a very kind of maternal aspect to her. Completely transformed the way I view death. There's something far more mysterious that sits the other side of death, and I need to prepare for death in some way. Preparing for death, I will make a meaningful life.
So I was lying there and I just had this overwhelming sense of death and that I was dying. And I know that that is the feeling of death. It was just, it's a feeling like no other feeling. And I just knew that that was what was happening in that moment. And I felt really lonely in that moment. I mean, it was just resistance from the offset. I don't really remember very much of the majority of this session, but I remember my ego being there and narrating everything, but to a point where I wanted to murder it. Suddenly I'm in this room, and it was red, and there was a spiral wooden staircase coming down, like very like gothic, but the walls were red because they were made of blood and bodies and skeletons, and I felt very scared, and I just had this overwhelming knowledge that all of this was my pain, and I was just suddenly surrounded by my pain, feeling completely helpless. And it was like I was in there for hours and I didn't know how to get out, even though there was a staircase going up. And I felt like, what is this? And then how is this living inside of me? I was like, this is illness. Like that's what it felt like. It just felt like toxic, awful, ugly pain. There was then a zoom out of this room and I realized it was my crypt, and I was just like, oh my gosh, like I'm scared and I don't know what to do. At one point I like knocked on some of the wall and there was gold underneath, but I dismissed it because I felt like it was my imagination. So I was like, that was wishful thinking. I can never get rid of this. This is just here. remember having a conversation afterwards. So a few of us, we were in Spain, so we were sat kind of outside, and it, you know, it was well past midnight, and we were chatting, and I was telling people about dying, and they were like, oh my gosh, that must have been terrifying. And I was like, it wasn't, because I know that part of me died, but part of me that I needed to die died. It was an ending, and it was so beautiful. It felt like the breath of God. Like, that's what death felt like. And God being whatever anyone wants to interpret God as, but that's what it felt like, just being breathed on in a really different way. What it has really shown me is that living authentically means that you can die authentically as well.
The ceremonies that I did within the Daime, it's a lot of singing. You're singing and you're dancing. We sing a lot of hymns, and they talk a lot about what they call the force. They talk about firming yourself in the force. And the force is kind of when the energy is flowing very strong. And what you really feel like you want to do is go crawl and lie down in a hole somewhere and curl away. But they talk about kind of firming yourself in this force, not backing away from it, and learning to kind of relax into it. I think it's kind of what I come to see it as death as well, and you know, in a way, or kind of like the afterlife is you're opening yourself up to the force of the universe, the power of the universe, to kind of relax into that. But when you go into your fears or your thoughts, or you kind of get out of the moment, is when you might have a harder time. That force, again, is what I would associate with death. There's no separation between self and universe, as it is all, you know, kind of one. And that's also a little bit of, I guess you could say, ego death as well, because you're kind of getting out of your mind and more just right into the present moment and into the flow of energy that's happening right at the moment. I think it affected kind of all aspects of my life, seeing what causes my suffering and seeing what causes suffering for others as well. Definitely made me reassess my life, how I wanted to live my life, be more connected with the natural world, try to live in harmony with, you know, the natural world as much as possible, maintain good relationships with friends, relatives, everybody that I came into contact with. My whole view of what to expect after, you know, at death, I think is it's no longer conceptual. I think medicine experiences that I had allowed me to have a direct perception of what I believe is at the afterlife. Whether or not we'll see, but instead of something to think about, it was more something that I felt like I actually experienced. So it was no longer a philosophical thing, but something I experienced directly. So no longer, talking about God, but actually experiencing God.
I had so many experiences of just like shape shifting and dying all these like deaths. And I know ayahuasca is sort of called like the rope of death. I remember at one point being buried alive in snow and sort of just this whiteness kind of covering me and being slowly unable to breathe. And then buried alive in this like marshmallow river of some kind. There was like thick marshmallows that started sort of caving in on me, watching my skin melt off, and then the muscles and then the bones sort of melting down to white and then melting away. And witnessing it as sort of a just what is happening to me, but letting it happen, like not fighting it. I think like this idea of being buried alive at first was kind of like, oh my God, I'm dying. What is this? I can't breathe, and being really anxious about it. And then just some sort of voice telling me like, just breathe, just let it go, you'll be fine, just let it go. Sort of like almost a reassuring voice in a way that you're going to be okay. It's just go with this. You'll understand later. Yeah, I just remember it being sort of like, oh my God, all these deaths are happening, but I'm still here. I'm still me. I haven't lost the me in all of this. And I think when you kind of learn to just surrender to whatever this experience is and let it go, like just let it happen, you realize that this consciousness that we have just goes with you. It's sort of like a transfer of energy, but you don't lose the I of your experience, like your whatever this witnessing is that we have, this ability to sort of like witness ourselves, whether it's through meditation or through these kind of experiences in psychedelics. There's just this like really interesting consciousness that just stays with you. It's the same consciousness. So even though we might like lose this like this vessel or this body that we're in, potentially, you kind of come out of these experiences thinking, okay, we don't have to be so scared of death. Whatever trepidation or fears I would have had before this, they're gone. Like I have no fear surrounding death anymore. I feel like I've somehow embodied that idea now of what death is. Like my body knows what to do. And so it's just, there's no more fear around it. It's just, okay, well, when the day does come for this bodily life to end, then it'll be the same. I've already experienced it multiple times through these other experiences. So I'll just accept it and like breathe into it and do the same thing that I did during psychedelics. I think with all of these sort of ego deaths or bodily deaths that I sort of had, these experiences, it really sort of like brought you to this state of just oneness with everything, this wonder. We are all part of all of this ego that we have that's sort of there to protect us, like in our regular everyday waking life, that when that dissolves, all the boundaries in the universe dissolve at the same time. And so, you kind of think like, well, why are we hurting each other, or why are we hurting the planet when we're all part of it? So there's something really lovely about that dissolution of ego, that even though it's there to protect us in some way, that there's something really special when it's not there, that when that boundary, comes away, if that is the space we go to, then it doesn't have to be so scary. Like having an embodied experience of what it could look like really makes you feel like, oh, but I've already experienced this. So, when the real death happens, quote unquote real death, it'll just be the same, or perhaps it'll be very similar. So there doesn't have to be such, immense anxiety surrounding this. But yeah, it's kind of almost comforting though to think that it's not just blackness at the end of this road, that there is something that continues on or carries on afterwards. Yeah, it's a comforting feeling to sort of have that embodied into your body.
For all of its positive transpersonal benefits regarding ego dissolution, science also confirms that ayahuasca has its efficacious neurological advantages. The plant medicine remarkably decreases activity in the default mode network of the brain, which is responsible for ego-fueled, self-orientated mental activities. Studies with the use of MRI techniques to inspect the default mode network during the psychedelic state induced by ayahuasca have shown significant decreases in activity through most parts of the default mode network. As a result, ayahuasca produces subacute and long-term improvements in affect and cognitive thinking style in non-pathological users. Upon reflection of my own personal experiences and the co-exploration with others who have learned from ayahuasca, I've realized that hearing their experiences has helped me to correlate universal themes of death that we all encounter as human beings. The attachment to ego, the fear of the unknown, and the message of surrender. I also could see the common thread of the teachings of the plant teacher, to live a more connected and caring life, to let go of ego attachment and pain, and to lean into love. This co-creative journey helped me to feel deeper empathy towards my fellow human, as we're all journeying down the same road towards the inevitable climax of death itself. In this realization, I feel that it deepens my practice as a death doula and adds value to the core tenets of the role, to help hold space with a person-centered focus, with compassion, non-attachment, and a vantage point of seeing people through the lens of interconnectivity and infinite consciousness.